I'm going to welcome onto the stage someone who I don't know how he sleeps, I don't know how he does all of this, and then turn up looking in this mocha suit as well, you know. You see this? You see the swag? You see it coming through? So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together. May I introduce you, the CEO of My Life, My Say, is the one, the only, is Mete Coban. Woo!
Morning, everyone. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Great. I always hate following Swazi on stage because she's just got so much energy, puts so much pressure on me. But look, firstly, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us in the morning here today for the Future of Britain Next Generation Conference. We're so glad to be back. I want to tell you a little bit about what the purpose of the conference is today and the partnership with the Tony Blair Institute, because I think it's really, really important that we understand that we're living in very turbulent times, and of course your voices as young people really matter to that. But before I do that, I want to take this opportunity to also tell you a little bit about My Life, My Say and what we do. So essentially we're a youth-led charity which is focused on trying to encourage young people to participate in democracy. And the way in which we do that is essentially provide a structured engagement platform between young people and decision makers to make sure that your voices are heard on some of the biggest issues that we're living through at the moment, because let's be honest, you know, we are living through very interesting times. You know, we've had 3 prime ministers in 3 months? 4 or 5 chancellors, 6 chancellors? I don't know, something like that in the space of a couple of months. And we've got some big issues. We've got the cost of living crisis, which we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about the future of work. This place where we're standing and sitting right now, when I was a kid, used to be an old abandoned factory and dog racetrack. And it's massively developed into a site with thousands of jobs, the future of technology and how it's going to shape, you know, how we all interact, how we move around, all those sorts of things. And it's really important that you have a voice in that. But also the future of our planet, which again, it's something that is incredibly close to my heart. So what we're trying to do with My Life, My Say and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change is essentially, you know, we want to make sure that as part of Future of Britain, is that we can put forward young people's voices and make sure that we have representative policies that move forward, that really drive the agenda moving forward in the country. And that's why this partnership is really important. Before I do hand over to our next speaker, which is why we're all here, and obviously to hear from you as well, I do want to say a few thank yous to a few funders and for partners for making today happen. The US Embassy in London, who's been incredibly helpful since the foundation of My Life, My Say, to really help promote democracy, not just in the UK, but around the world. And without them, there's no way that we would exist as an organization. The Paul Hamlin Foundation, the John Ellerman Foundation, the National Lottery Community Fund, Body Shop UK for helping support us today, Young Women's Trust, again, for helping us support us today, Loughborough University, Badu Sports as well. There are so many different organizations, and I'm so sorry if I have missed out any. But thank you all so much for being with us today. What we are going to do today is you're going to have a whole day of activity. You know, there's going to be some conversations that are happening here. But what we really want to hear from is your voices. And we've got democracy cafes happening today, which is our reinvigoration of a 17th century concept of talking about politics over coffee or frappuccino. It's a partnership we have with Starbucks. So we're going to be doing Democracy Cafes live today. Then we've got Make It Make Sense sessions as well. But without further ado, the next person I do want to introduce as a speaker is very important. I'm obviously very proud to be hosting here today for My Life, My Say. And the reason why Tony Blair is with us today is because when we were thinking about the conference and how do we make sure, that we can make sure that your voices are heard, what we wanted to do is really help to try to bridge that gap between the people at the very highest level of government and also your voices. And for you to really understand how is it that all these things that we talk about today, how do we actually make change? And we're very lucky that we've got the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was in government for 10 years, and who's going to talk to you a bit about that. So without further ado, I want you to raise the sound of the room and please welcome the former Prime Minister Tony Blair.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, and to say a big thanks to Mete and to My Life, My Say for the partnership with my organization. And Mete is actually, when I get pessimistic about British politics, he makes me optimistic. Because if this is the future, we've got a chance. Because that combination of hard work, intelligence, and actually political courage. He's also a Hackney councillor. I tried 3 times to become a Hackney councillor and failed. So you've got about 30 years as Prime Minister coming up. I was saying to Swazi beforehand that she said to me, what did you do in politics when you were aged 20? And I said, which is true, that I had absolutely no interest in politics at all when I was 20. I would have been horrified to be told I was going to be a politician. 2 years later, I was fascinated by it. And so we all find our own way into politics. But what I thought I'd do just in a few brief opening remarks is tell you some of the things I've learnt about it. So politics is frustrating. It can be vicious. It can be more about intrigue than ideas. It can be disillusioning, and it can be disappointing. But it's also, in the end, the only path to change. You don't get change without politics and without political action. And if you think about any of the progress that's been made throughout our history, it's always come about ultimately through political activism. You think of the abolition of slavery, you think of the Factories Act in the 19th century, you think of the right to vote, the right for women to vote, the National Health Service, you think even in my government, the establishment of a minimum wage, gay rights. All of these things happened because you had political activism that led to political change. In fact, if you think about here, I mean, we were just saying, right, this was a derelict part of London. With the Olympic bid, it was rejuvenated, and now we have this extraordinary situation where you've got how many universities? 5 universities, £350 million worth of money goes to wages every year here. You have how many jobs? 10,500 jobs. Right, so, and this building is a symbol of the fact that change can happen. Because sometimes when you're in the day-to-day, you get very depressed and you think, can it ever happen? But it does, okay. And it happens by a combination of activism, you've got to be active and engaged in politics, but also persuasion. Because none of these causes come about, particularly in a democracy, unless you persuade people of the need for change. So you need a cause and a campaign. And what is interesting about today is, and the interesting thing about our partnership between the Future of Britain Conference, my institute, and My Life, My Say, if you think of the big challenges today, I would say, okay, you've got 3 big revolutions going on. A climate revolution, because we're going to have to change the way that we consume. Brexit, you may agree, disagree. Personally, I disagreed, but it's a revolution. You've got the technology revolution itself, AI, quantum computing. All of this is going to change the way that the world works. In addition to that, you've got 3 revolutions. You've got 1 crisis, which is a cost of living crisis, possibly 2 if you include the Ukraine war. And the interesting thing and the important thing about all of these changes is that, number one, and this hasn't always been true in political history, number one, they affect young people particularly. Right, you are the people that are going to be affected by climate change more than my generation. You are the people that are going to be affected by the fact we're out of the European Union, not in the European Union, more than my generation. And the other thing is, it's the younger generation that probably understand these changes better than the older generation. So the technology revolution, you will be much more familiar with and live your lives around than my generation. My generation's got to catch up with it. So, I mean, I had to give a speech recently on cryptocurrency. So I was studying this thing, and I got in touch with my eldest son who's in the technology sector, and I said to him, you got to help me with this stuff. So anyway, he explained I didn't understand. He then sent me what was called the Idiot's Guide to Cryptocurrency. I didn't understand that either. So just before I was due to speak, I phoned him up and said, look, what on earth am I going to say to these people? And he said, say you're sick. Find any excuse, but do not go on that stage because you are not capable of talking about it. Actually, it turns out that most people aren't capable of talking about it, so there you go. But the point is, you are both impacted and you probably have a clearer idea of the types of things that are going to result in solutions. So this is a great moment for active political engagement. However, the best politics comes not just from having a cause and not just from having a campaign, but having a plan. And there's no point in trying to agitate over these big challenges unless you are also prepared to engage with the way you overcome them. And that is the practical side of politics that is so important. And in a way, sometimes it's quite easy to identify the cause, the thing you care about and are passionate about. And if you're got the energy, it's even quite easy to imagine the campaign that you run. But the really hard thing is policy. And what I discovered in my time as Prime Minister is that the hardest thing is not posing the right question, it's getting the right answer. And so this is where a deep engagement, like today is about, is so important. A couple of other things just to say by way of opening. The first is that I think our politics is, in this 21st century, particularly in Western countries, is not, it hasn't matured. It's still 20th century politics. A lot of it is still around the idea of how, is it the private sector or is it the state? Is it enterprise or is it government? Whereas the truth today is you need to reimagine both. You need to reimagine how the business sector works and you need to reimagine how government works. And both of those things, by the way, dramatically impacted by the technology revolution. And so part of what you will find as you get engaged in real politics is that the way the political system works at the moment pushes people into categories that don't often fit the reality of the way people live today, work today, think today, and interact with each other. Which brings me to the final point, which is around partnership. I mean, My Life, My Say and my institute are in partnership together because a lot of the unfairness is intergenerational. You know, if you take housing, cost of living, young people, really impacted by it, far more than my generation on the whole. But also, because of this need for a cause and a campaign leading to persuasion, you also need to reach across the generations so that people are talking to each other and understanding each other and working with each other. And that's where you put together, I guess, one of the great things you learn about politics ultimately, which is you need a combination of having principles and having the determination to get power, right? If you have power without principle, well, it's going to end in disillusion, disappointment, or even disaster. But if you have principle without power, then they're just kind of aspirations, they're sentiments that you have, they're feelings, they're things you care strongly about. But you need the power in order to effect the change. And change is ultimately what matters. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tony. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a bit of a Q&A conversation. I always find one of the fascinating things about whenever I speak to you, Tony, is you're very curious about change. And even after, some could say you've done it all, right? You've been Prime Minister for 10 years and, you don't have to think about the future of the country. There are other people who are leading the country now. And one of the things I always find fascinating about you is you're always thinking about new ideas around how we can sort of, really develop this country. And even from your speech today, I've got so many questions to follow up with. But I guess the first question to really kick us off today, and the purpose of us being here today, is obviously the Future of Britain project. And how we came about with Future of Britain in June earlier this year, what the purpose of it is, and really from your side and from your perspective, and from your institute's perspective, what is it that you want either young people from this conference to take away today, or what do you want to take away from them?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I'm always not quite sure whether I think curiosity is just my way of trying to slow down the aging process. You know, if you keep curious, you sort of at least keep some connection with the way the world actually is, and rather than how it used to be. I think the most important thing, I think, is to work out what we think are the. Sorry if you can't see us a bit with this. Is it possible to move that? Is that bolted down to the floor? Is it?
Yeah, we'll see if we can move it.
Let me.
It might be a bit heavy. There we go.
It's just heavy. There you go.
There you go.
So I think it's partly for you guys who are going to be the next generation of activists to learn at least and talk with each other about the experience of what you're doing and how you're trying to achieve change and so on. So because the processes of politics do matter, and you've got to master them. And, you know, politics should never be, thank you, politics should never be a profession, it's a vocation. On the other hand, like any vocation, you can do it well or you can do it badly, so you've got to learn about that. But the other thing, which is why I've got some of my people here and an active part of the conference, is that so that we also get from young people what they're thinking about, what they're talking about, and what it is that would be an acceptable, you know, relationship almost between the generations. Because the reason we did the Future of Britain conference is that I think this country's in a difficult place right now. I mean, I really do think it's in a very difficult place, more difficult than it thinks. And we need a new energy into our politics that's got to be about finding the right answer and not just about two groups of people who are just engaged in a political campaign against each other.
Yeah. And I guess just to kind of follow up on that, you know, one of the things that we recently done a poll with Opinion, which the results wouldn't surprise you, but one of the things that came out from it is that 55% of young people who responded to that poll said that they completely distrust politicians. Yeah. And so my question to you is how did we get there? Is that something new, or how do we fix it?
Okay, so I think there's no point in me coming to something like this unless I'm really honest with you about what I think, okay? People have always distrusted politicians, right? I've been reading this book about the fall of the Roman Empire. And basically, when they were all arguing in the Roman Senate, it was all about, you know, we can't trust today's group of politicians and da-da-da-da-da. I think people always will feel that, and partly because politics happens in an atmosphere where people are always challenging your motives. I mean, one of the things that's really difficult when you get into politics, it's why the business of politics is often very tough, is you can do something that you think is right, and people are going to ascribe not merely they'll say you're doing the wrong thing, but they're also saying you're doing it because you're a bad person, right? And all of that creates an atmosphere of distrust. But the only way you ultimately get trust in politics is delivery. It's about change. And it's about making change. If you make the change, okay, they'll still say that they distrust the politicians, because people always will. But at least you have something that's real. And the challenge of democracy today, and it is a real challenge, by the way, because I think there is quite a significant section of people who just think democracy doesn't work anymore. Right? The challenge of democracy is efficacy. Now, if you look at the media, you'd think it's all about transparency. Are they honest enough? And, you know, this is a game politicians play with the media. You know, is this the honest politician? And, you know, who's telling it like it really is? And, you know, you end up with someone like Farage becoming, oh, yeah, he's the guy who tells it like it is when, you know, he's telling it like it isn't. So if you put that as your lodestar, as your litmus test, you're going to go wrong. The real test is effectiveness. If you've got a passionate cause, are you actually able to deliver it? Because if you deliver it, even if people still say they distrust politicians in general, they'll think, well, at least it's worth engaging in the democratic process.
Yeah, and I guess we were talking about this just before we came out on the stage, is I'd really love for you to, I guess, tell the audience a bit more. And I always found this a bit curious before I got into politics myself. It's like the world of politics is like you watch it on TV. It's like you think it's this, you know, the group of people who are, you know, fixing deals and making decisions on behalf of the whole world. You know, you were the Prime Minister for 10 years. You know, what is the world of politics like, actually?
Well, it's confusing. I mean, look, the first thing is, politics is a tough place for normal people. I mean, you seem pretty normal, which is why I'm really pleased you're in politics. You know, you probably care about other things other than politics, right, as well. You know, when you're out with your friends, you're probably talking about a whole range of different things. But politics, when you're especially at the senior level, it's a very, you know, it's very intense, very focused, and it's always much more chaotic than you think it is. It's one of the things I always say to leaders, because my institute works with many different leaders around the world. I do what I do with the institute, which is partly around this future of Britain, but also partly we have teams of people who go and live and work in countries around the world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Middle East, elsewhere, and we basically work with leaders to effect change. And I do this because the two things I learned in my time in politics was that the hardest thing is to get anything done, right? And the second thing is that being in power is almost like a conspiracy of distraction, because you're constantly got events and crises and personality issues and, you know, the nonsense of politics, and therefore you get distracted from the thing that you really want to achieve. So the most important thing, therefore, is always to have a clear sense of what it is you really want to achieve, and you've got to treat the stuff of politics, you just treat it as a necessary part of, you know, how you get on, but don't confuse it with the thing that's brought you into politics. Never lose that, because otherwise, honestly, it becomes I mean, I would never be in politics if I didn't really want to do something, you know, about the world, as it were. I mean, there's just no point, because the rest of it is too grim. And there are a lot of quite strange people in politics.
And I guess it's just to follow up on that, because I'm always really curious about, I think we had this conversation before as well. One of the things that I find that's really worrying and concerning about the world of politics, not just, you know, in the last 2 years, and not just in the UK, by the way, but everywhere, but everything just seems so reactive to sort of day-to-day events. And I guess it's very easy to fall into that trap, because as you say, you know, if you're the Prime Minister, you've probably got all sorts of things that you're dealing with, and you never really have the time to really properly delve into anything. So how do you sort of manage your time effectively in sort of, you know, really carving out what was my purpose of being here, whilst at the same time having to deal with, let's say, you know, a war that just arose in Ukraine, you know, like the reality of the world?
Yeah, so you get, but it's true whether you're in government or even if you're an activist. So what are the distractions? The distractions are events and crises and scandals, and the hardest thing you'll find if you're running any sort of campaign is managing people, getting the right people, frankly, shifting out the wrong people, trying to, you know, when everyone's going to fall out with each other. And the important thing is there is a spirit that I think works in politics, but it's quite rare. I mean, a lot of politics, and particularly I think social media has accelerated this development, it's a sort of populism which can be left or right, but it's what I call the finger jabbing bit of politics. It's that you are, you know, you must think this, and if you don't, you know, you're a bad person. And that divisiveness it's never productive, but you can do it very easily. And the problem is you can rise to quite near the top of a political party by adopting it, unfortunately. I mean, this is, you know, one of the problems when ideology takes over a political party is that what happens is you get a whole lot of people who work out, okay, I know what to say. I don't know what to say to rise to the top, so I'm just going to say it. And that's why I say it's very important that you're pulling what I would call, you know, people who are broad human beings and not just, you know, they just want to rise to the top in politics. And that is because everything is going to try and get in the way of you fulfilling your real ambition in politics. Everything, as I say, it's a conspiracy of distraction. So what you've got to do is you've got to carve out the time, and you've got to draw around you a group of people who you can be really honest with when you're talking about tactics and strategy in a campaign, who you can sit with and, in a non-judgmental way, have an open and good conversation. And by the way, in politics, I think you meet the worst type of people, but I also think you meet the best type of people. I had both, and they were surprising. You get surprised, actually. Some people you thought were great, turns out they were just nice to you because they were. I had an amazing number of people who were my strongest supporters until I had to dismiss them in government, and then they discovered an enormous sense of principle against what I've been doing for the last 20 years when they've been doing it with me. But then I also had people who were genuine and good people, and who, even when you did things they either didn't agree with or were difficult for them, they stood by you. So I think it's also, I wouldn't go into politics unless you've got a basically optimistic frame of mind. Yeah. Optimism's...
You've got to be, innit?
You've got to be a bit optimistic.
Yeah. And I guess that nicely follows into the next question, which is, a lot of people here, and I guess, speaking as, I like to think I'm still young, I'm 30 now.
You're 30?
30 now, yeah, I've just turned 30. So we've changed the definition of, so like with My Life, My Say, we have our target audience. Used to be 1824, that's why I turned 25, and now, and then it used to be 1829, and now it's 1835 maybe. At some point we'll have to stick to it. But I guess for a lot of young people, Tony, they'll feel really cheated, right, by what's going out there. I live for a generation where, tuition fees got tripled, scrapping off the EMA. Being able to afford a property or to even rent now, we're not even talking about renting a property, renting a room is probably expensive in London. Obviously our planet, the lack of action that's being taken to sort of really solve the climate crisis that we face, the lack of opportunities, obviously we saw what happened with COVID. What hope is there for young people?
Well, the hope is to realize that change does happen. And therefore the question is to work out how it happens and then do it. So it's not that, we should always have hope, because if you take the broad sweep of history, things have changed, and there are a whole. Look, if you take London today and look at London 60 years ago, it's a very different place. Now there are a lot of challenges and things wrong with it, but there are things that have improved for the better. And I think it's important that we do keep that in mind, and then the challenge is. And this is where you require, you require the discipline also to be successful. That's why I said at the end, there's no point in having principles unless you're prepared to also get power. And, I became leader of the Labour Party when we lost 4 elections in a row. And I always remember going to my first meeting as Labour leaders in 1994, before you were all born, and you were about 1.5 years old, and someone got up and said to me, Tony, the British people have now voted against us 4 times in a row. What on earth is wrong with them? And no, it's what's wrong with us we've got to think about. If we keep losing, we're doing something wrong, right? So you have to have the discipline, and in 120 years of Labour history, for example, Labour's never won 2 consecutive full terms except once, or 3 except once. And the longest we'd ever been in power before 1997 was 6 years. Even the 1945 government, in 1951 it was out. So if you want to make change, and that requires over a period of time, you've got also to have the discipline to say, okay, we do have a good cause, and we do have a good campaign, but how do we build a coalition that's big enough and broad enough to succeed? How do we get power?
Yeah. Really good points there. One of the other things that came out of our poll that we done with opinion was that 48% of people who responded thinks that the government or governments tend to favour the interests of business leaders or those most wealthy over young people. Do you agree with this statement, or do you think, like when you were Prime Minister, for example, how would you sort of balance out the views of, for example, those who probably have a bit more influence on the people around you or your office or Downing Street, sort of like knowing, like place like Hackney, for example, right? Like where I'm from, I was lucky because, if it wasn't for your government investing like £300-400 million into schools in Hackney, we couldn't go to school in Hackney. Or this site where we are right now, which is the, it's now the media centre, places like Hackney and people like me who are son of immigrants massively benefited from a government that, invested a lot of money. So how do you sort of make that trade-off between, the interests of those who've probably got a bit more access to sort of Downing Street, the sort of the people that that actually need support?
Yeah, it's a great question, but it comes back to the same thing, which is to have a smart enough strategy that, for example, if you end up alienating the business community, you're going to struggle to win an election. That's just a fact. Now, some people say, no, well, we should. Okay, I say, okay, you just lose. Right. I mean, I can't think of an election victory in Britain in living memory that hasn't had at least a section of the business community with Labour, right? Traditionally, they vote Tory, right? But I was determined they were going to be happy enough, right? Okay. Now, that then gave us the permission to do those other things, or it gave us the political space to do those other things. And that's why you've got to it's always about having the strategy that allows you to succeed. And, that's just the way it is. And if you think about here and now, and what we have here, and even the Olympics coming to the UK, I mean, if I was saying to you beforehand, if we'd done Brexit by then, we would never have won that Olympic bid, right? So it matters. Who's in power matters. But you've got to be in power. So, you can say whatever you like. It's about, and this is why it's important that you also, recognize that politics does involve some difficult compromises and trade-offs. Because if you're trying to succeed, you've got to bring people with you. I mean, when we did, for example, the campaign around equal rights for gay people and so on, this was a campaign that literally, before we were in power, for years and years and years, this has been a fundamental dividing point with the Conservatives. And part of the reason we succeeded was because the way that campaign was conducted, it pulled some people who were, not quite sure and so on. It didn't jab the finger at them. It said, look, here's the way the world is. Here's the rights of people that you should respect. They were prepared to reach out and have a dialogue with people who disagreed with them. And that is important if you want to win power. Yeah. If you want to be out there saying I'm a deeply principled person as opposed to all these unprincipled people, that's fine. I mean, and that's a thing in politics. You get that. But you learn over time to despise it because it doesn't result in success.
Yeah. You touched on Brexit in your answer, and I guess, that's the big elephant in the room, not just in this room, but also in the country. Most people, I mean, by way of showing off hands, how many people actually voted in the European referendum? Okay. And of those who voted, how many of you voted to remain? Okay, so most of the people who voted actually voted to remain.
And some of the people that didn't vote presumably were too young.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And what we do see from a lot of polling actually, and a lot of research, and obviously the work that we do, is people do want closer alignment with the European Union because fundamentally, a lot of the benefits that previous generations have enjoyed, i.e. picking up your bags and just going to France and maybe saying you're going to work there, you can't do those sorts of things anymore. Is there an opportunity, in your mind, what's the pathway forward? What would you be doing if you were the Prime Minister? And also, is there a route back to maybe potentially sort of rejoining the European Union?
Well, I think in the short term, the most important thing is to get into a proper working relationship with Europe. And, just the other week, my institute published a paper setting out a whole series of things you could do around trade, around fixing the Northern Ireland situation, around security and cooperation there, around research and science. And there are a whole series of things around making sure professional qualifications are easier, making it easier for students and so on to travel between places. So there are a series of things you can do in the immediate term to fix the relationship, and we should fix it. And in my view, that's a perfectly good debate to have. Now, I think it will be for a later generation, for your generation, to decide, well, how much further do you want to take that? Because in a way with Brexit, I feel you're in a kind of unspoken negotiation. The British people's in a kind of negotiation with itself at the moment. Just thinking about it and thinking what they were promised and what's actually resulted from it. I think there's something else, though, that's interesting about politics. And it's why, one of the reasons I always discourage populism on the left is that I say, if you end up with a populist type of politics, it's always the right that will succeed. And that's why it's very dangerous for the left to engage in it, because it then helps create the space for a right-wing populism. And look, the thing we've also got to think about as a country is how did we come to the point where we took a decision of this importance with multiple layers of complexity and difficulty, requiring a deep study of detail, and decide this question of immense importance on one day, in a one-line, one-off, yes-no referendum, when we didn't even know, when we voted to leave, what we were voting to join. There was a recklessness about that process. And, it's a recklessness that we wouldn't dream of doing about an even mildly important decision in our own lives. And we did that in respect of a destiny-changing decision for the country. And so we've got to think about how we came to that conclusion. And a lot of people say, well, the Prime Minister at the time should never have had the referendum, but I remember the pressure he was under to do it. And in the 2015 election campaign, I think I was about the only reasonably senior politician who made a speech saying the referendum itself is a bad idea. It's not the right way to make a decision of this nature. So it's also important that I think there's a lot that can be done to fix the immediate problems, and then it will be, in a sense, for people like yourselves also to engage in a campaign to restore a sensible position for Britain in Europe, and who knows what happens in the future. But it's also important for us to reflect as a country as to how we take decisions of importance and why, democracy is not just about, whatever's flowing through social media or any one day or a plebiscite of the people. It's actually about understanding issues, going deep into them. It's about political engagement, not just every 5 years, but also throughout the day, the week, the month, the year. And this is, I feel very, very strongly about it. It's one of the reasons I do what I do and why we work with you is, in the end, getting the right answer is important. And that's not the same as a show of hands, just saying, okay, do we leave? Do we stay? Yeah, okay.
But I guess, on that point, though, do you think, we're having this conversation, and I know, you're very interested in it, your institute's very interested in it, we're interested in it in terms of exploring what that what that relationship could look like. But the trouble we have now is obviously that conversation isn't even being had among, in Parliament. No one's really talking about, what is the future of our relationship with the European Union as a result of what happened with the European Union, what is our relationship with the rest of the world. We're talking about climate change. Climate change doesn't recognize borders, does it? Or, for example, security doesn't recognize borders. We're living in a very different time. And it's just, for a lot of people, it just feels really disheartening that we're not even having this conversation.
Yeah, but that's the purpose of getting involved and getting engaged, so just to force people to have it. And in the end, politics does respond, by the way, to pressure from people. One of the reasons we have Brexit is because of that. It's because there was pressure coming the other way that was very well organized.
Yeah. And on that point, I guess, is, democracy is not just about voting once every 5 years, is it? It's not just you go and you put your eggs in the ballot box. It's about, how do you sort of advise people here to sort of continuously engage in politics in a way that, if you were the Prime Minister, what sort of pressure would you sort of cave into? You know, how can they influence you? Like, what would be, you know, like, I know as a councillor, like,
cave into maybe the wrong description, but yeah, but I know what you mean. Well, there are a lot of things that we did that were a result of campaigns outside of the mainstream political parties. And it's always about mounting a reasonable argument and then conducting it reasonably. One of the things that happens when you get to a very senior level of politics is that you realize, frankly, you can't give in to everybody, right? And I always say one of the lessons of leadership is that in the end you have to say no, even to the people that support you and like you, and you know sometimes you do. So it's a difficult thing, this, but you can for sure affect politics. Now, you can affect it inside the political party, and part of the trouble is if anyone thinks it wants to become an MP, the reality is you're going to have to think about which political party you join and how you're active within it. But you can get a lot done outside political parties, and there are people who do that, and do that successfully. Yeah. But if you want to know how to affect people in power, it's to mount a campaign that is a clear point, a clear strategy, and builds as broad a coalition as possible.
Yeah. And there are some things that, you know, my mayor said from Hackney as well, and, you know, I find, like, at a local government level as a councillor, I mean, I don't know if Phil would agree with me, but I find if you get, for example, like, I'm a councillor for Stoke Newington, and if I get, like, 4 or 5 different residents in my ward email me about one issue, all of a sudden, the whole, you know, internal, you know, machine of the council starts to, you know, jumping up around, how do we respond to this, what do we do, and I guess it's, you know, what we want to get across to you in this conference today, and partly the reason why the Democracy Cafes are really important, is helping you, give you the tools to understand, okay, how do you actually, you know, help shape the decisions that are being made locally. By the way, if you see me on my phone, I'm not being rude. This is the Gen Z way of moderating a panel. Also,
no, I got that. Yeah.
So for future conferences, just us trying.
I didn't think you were just texting your mum saying, "I'm stuck on a stage here with this guy. I can't get him off."
This is me trying to be relevant with, you know, the 25.
I get it. But the thing is as well is to realize you've always got to distinguish when you're getting a lot of noise as to how representative the noise is. And one of the problems with social media nowadays is that the noise levels are so great, if you're not careful, you think they represent, you know, the whole of opinion, and they don't. And you've got to, I mean, it's a new world out there in that sense. And again, normal people outside of politics, they have many different thoughts going on in their head at the same time. And at one level, by the way, even though they dislike politicians, they put pressure on politicians, they also kind of understand it's a difficult business. I mean, I remember in the 2005 election campaign, I was going for my 3rd election victory, right? So it was a tough campaign for all sorts of very obvious reasons, right? It was a tough campaign. And absolutely unbelievably, my 2 eldest sons, who'd never shown any interest, the only thing they were ever proud of that I did in government was appear on an episode of The Simpsons. Other than that, they had no interest in what I was doing. But they agreed to come out and campaign with me. So we took them out into what was one of the marginal seats, because that's where I went as the Prime Minister. And we got them out on the doorstep. Anyway, my eldest son was doing his canvassing up the street. My middle son, Nicky, knocked on this guy's door, and the guy opens the door, and he says, "You from the Labour Party?" And Nicky says, "Yeah." He says, "I hate Tony Blair. I hate him." My wife says to me, "You're going to put your foot through the telly every time that guy comes on." So anyway, he goes into this tirade about, I'm the most terrible Prime Minister the country's ever had, and he slams the door, right? Nicky wanders off. And he sees Ewan up the street, and he says, "It's pretty tough, isn't it, Ewan?" And he says, "Yeah, no, it's tough." And he said, "You should go and knock on number 21. He said, "Big fan of Dad's." He said, "You'll love it. You're going to get a great reaction." So Ewan goes and knocks on the door, and kind of, "What? This is another guy from the Labour Party." So he goes into even bigger tirade about me, about it. And finally Ewan says to him, "You know, that's my dad you're talking about." And the guy goes, oh, I'm really sorry, son, come and have a cup of tea. And the point is, people, you've got to, in the end, you've got to be able to, it's more complicated than you think, and people, you know, they've, sometimes what it is about people wanting to be listened to.
Exactly, yeah.
So, you know, anyway.
And it's that having that opportunity to really vent out your, I mean, I have it as even, like as a counsellor sometimes, you go onto someone's doorstep and they'll sit there for half an hour, tell you about how, for example, they hate the fact that people ride scooters on pavements and they hate the council for it and etc. And in the end, they're like, you know, they start off with saying, oh, I'm never going to vote for you, etc. And in the end, they're like, well, actually, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you listen to me. I'll vote for you. I won't vote for the Labour Party, but I'll vote for you. So I think it's going back to that point, which is exactly why we're here, right? Which is around how do we make sure that people who aren't often listened to, you know, have their voices heard. And I guess one of the things that you spoke about in your speeches, and it's something that I talked to Ryan a lot about, is also from the Tony Blair Institute, who you're going to hear from a bit later today, is the importance of intergenerational dialogue. Because a lot of these challenges that we face, ultimately, you know, you've got to have, you know, one of the things that we've found through our studies over the past couple of years is, and not just in the UK, but around the world, there are two growing divides. One is the intergenerational divide between young and old, and then the second one is that divide between urban and rural areas. And so I guess the question for you is, you know, you spoke about the importance, and that's why our partnership is really important. But how do we sort of progress that agenda in terms of bringing together a generation? How do we build that empathy and understanding across those generations?
I think we need to try and be more creative about it, because I do think we need forums where there can be that engagement. I mean, Brexit was the classic case, wasn't it, really?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you have just a very stark divide between the older and the younger generation. And I think it's really important we try and establish forums where this can happen, and where, you know, because a lot of it is a failure to understand. You know, part of the problem, and this is why, you know, one of the things we do from the Institute is work particularly on the technology revolution and its implications for how we govern and how we, you know, how we reorder really the business of government and the state. But for an older generation, this is often something that just frightens them. And the other thing is that, you know, I don't think the state sort of directing people anymore is the way it's going to work, because, you know, people live their lives today wanting to be empowered as people, right? They don't want someone telling them this is what this is what you should do. They want to be empowered to live their own lives in the way that they want. And I think the older generation, even if it says it's really concerned about the younger generation, still thinks of it essentially in a paternalistic way. You know, here's the government, you give the power to the government then hands down the benefits to the people. I just don't think it works like that anymore. So I would say we need to just establish we need a far greater understanding of this intergenerational problem. I think the older generation needs to understand that for a lot of young people, they are potentially the first generation in living memory which is not going to do better than the existing generation or their parents' generation. And that is a big, big challenge.
Yeah. And do you think, you know, like in your time, you've done many constitutional, like, major reforms, right? Like House of Lords, for example, abolishing sort of the life peers to the extent hereditary peers that were there. If you were sort of, I guess, back in number 10 now, what would be some of the more immediate sort of like reforms or changes that you would bring to make politics more accessible?
Well, I think, you know, there's a case, for example, for constitutional reform around proportional representation, electoral reform and all of that. The trouble is, you can't make any of these reforms unless you get into power under the existing system.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, there is a tendency for people to take refuge in constitutional change as an answer to an actual practical problem. Whereas constitutional change is only a means of how you make a decision. It doesn't, in the end, you know, all the decision. So if the challenge is right, which it is, okay, what's the problem with Britain today? We are more highly taxed than we've been since the war.
Yeah.
We're spending more, actually public spending is higher than it's been for many, many years. We're actually getting a bad service for the money we're spending. I mean, the National Health Service, I think, is, virtually collapsing at the moment. So the answers to how you reimagine all of that, and for example, think about how you change the health service completely so that you turn it into a something that's promoting wellness rather than simply something that's curing disease. It's about health, it's not about disease. That, it doesn't matter what whatever system you have for choosing your government, getting the answer right is the hardest part of that. So I'm not against constitutional change, but I always used to say, because we introduced all the devolution, and look, in Northern Ireland, it was, that constitutional change was a vital part of bringing peace to Northern Ireland. When I was the age of most people in the audience, I mean, every morning you would be waking up to fresh terrorism, or people being killed in the sectarian struggles in Northern Ireland. That ended in part because we were able to make constitutional change, but it still required a political agreement behind that was in the end more important than the details of the Constitution.
Yeah. And on for example, one of the things that we're focused on as an organization is around voting. And, one of the things that I find really mind-blowing in this country is we don't have a system in which anyone, this is 2022, by the way, you don't have a system where you can go online and check if you're registered to vote. You have to go through your local authority electoral office to check if you're registered to vote. Or most people I know, like me, sometimes if I'm unsure, I just re-register to vote just to be on the safe side. But there's no actual centralized system where you could check on Google like there is in America. Or for example, the fact that, voting still happens on a work day, where actually the world of work is different now. Before it used to be 9 to 5, whereas now it's like people work from 11 to 8 at night, or different shifting patterns, or the fact that we don't have online voting. Are there practical changes that you would explore without necessarily sort of committing to anything? I.e., for example, how do you feel about online voting?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Yeah?
I would explore all of these things. Why don't you make it as easy as possible for people to participate?
And votes at 16?
Votes at 16? Not so sure about that one. But, and we had a lot of debate about it, as we did about PR. But making it easier for people to vote, making it an objective of government to make it easy for people to vote, no, for sure. We should do all of that. Look, and also we should think about technology and just, it's changing Thing is I always say this about government, is if Clement Attlee, who was the Labour Prime Minister in 1945, right? Clement Attlee, if he came back to the UK today, right, he would think, oh my God, everything's changed. Everything's different. And then he'd go back into Whitehall and he'd say, oh, no, actually, no. Government is always the last thing to change. And of course, and everything about the way we interact with citizens, everything should change.
Yeah. And then I guess two final questions for you is, one is, we spoke a lot about change from what needs to happen from government, right? We spoke about experience, we spoke about some policy, etc. I guess there is a question about also the politician and the leaders. And what I mean by that is what are some of the sort of things that you need to do to be more accessible? So one of the things that I always remember you for example, when I was a kid, was seeing your match of the day, right? And I know obviously you're a big Newcastle fan as well, and you're doing well in the Premier League right now. But was that your effort in terms of trying to be more relatable to people, or get into room and spaces where, for example, most people will go to but wouldn't typically think about politics? And do you think more of that needs to happen? And what sort of things would you do to make politics more relatable?
Look, I think to be absolutely, I can, this distance, be completely open about it. Some of these things are as much PR as they are really relating to people, right? You're on Match of the Day. You're not exactly, mixing with the normal folk, i.e., you're there with Gary Lineker, whoever it is. I can't even remember who it was at the time. Or, I used to do the Brit Awards and that type of thing. What a complete nightmare that was. You had to make sure you were on early before they all got absolutely smashed. Otherwise, there was heaven knows what they'd say to you or want to do to you. So all of these things, I mean, to be absolutely honest, they're PR. However, I tell you what I did find really, really useful, and that is going out into a part of the country, not having a big media circus in tow, and sitting down for a morning with, for example, people who work in the health service, with, for example, people operating in public safety, with, for example, teachers who actually teach people, real pupils in real schools. You would learn an immense. You get much more out of that than you do, frankly, if you're,
And is that something that you had to fight for in terms of like, is that something that was built into your time, or was that something that you would sort of like consciously say, look, I want to make sure that every week I do 2 or 3 visits, for example?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's really important, one of the reasons we do what we do now, is to help people in government learn the lessons from all the things we didn't do and then learnt we had to do. Yeah. So I would always learn more from going out and engaging with people actually doing things than I would from any number of policy papers written to me. Yeah. And the other thing is to set aside time for strategy, because you need to, every Friday most Fridays, but then at least once a month, most Fridays, a small group of people, at least once a month, I would sit down with a key team. And it was, what we used to call the, what's it all about, Alfie moment, where you sort of take a step back and say, okay, what are we trying to do here? But what are we really trying to do? What's the big picture? And I think that's very, very important, because otherwise you get locked in the day-to-day. And, you have to carve out the time. Especially as you get more senior in politics, you realize your time is your very valuable commodity. So you've got to have thinking time. And the other thing, which I would do today particularly, when I'm asked sometimes from young people who want to go into politics, I say, first go and learn about the world. So my strong advice is do not go to university, study politics, come out, go and be a researcher to an MP, work your way up, become an MP, and then, because in the end, you can do that, by the way, and you can probably do it quite successfully. But when you're actually in government, it really helps to know about the world. So go and work in a completely work with people who aren't political as well. Because then you realize most people don't spend their time thinking about politics. They really don't. And so it's helpful, the more you learn about the world, and today, this is what I've tried, I may say, mainly unsuccessfully, to say to my own kids, go and study other cultures. I mean, there's a whole world out there. I mean, part of the problem for Britain today is to liberate itself from being, within its own narrow space. We're in a changing world. This world is, geopolitically, obviously, it's going to change dramatically. I mean, we haven't talked about that, but it's now the risen China is the single biggest geopolitical change in your lifetime. It's going to make everything different. India may be coming down the track too, so that's going to be, the whole of the world's politics is going to change. Britain's place in the world has got to change. So learn about the world, and then you'll be a much better politician.
Yeah, and you slightly answered my final question, which I guess is, again, going back to your speech. You spoke about, obviously, the conversation we had with Swazi as well about, what would you, when you were age 20, 21, 22, what would you advise a young Tony Blair, age 21, looking back now?
I think, well, I would definitely say this about learning about the world. I think the only other thing I'd say about politics is that...
Also, it doesn't have to be about politics as well. It could be about anything that you could... Yeah. Well, let's stick to politics.
Yeah, I think so. Let's stick to politics, yeah. I think, ultimately... I mean, I know it sounds a little idealistic, this, but I do think that ultimately you should, in politics, right, because, political people, once you become political, there's a level of calculation that comes into your mind, right? Let's be realistic about it. But I think always, on the important things, do what you think is right. Keep to what you think is right, because one, you'll sleep easier, and two, one of the lessons I have learned about politics is that if you calculate too much, you miscalculate. And it's a weird kind of thing, this, because you think, well, that's... But I became an MP. I was the last candidate in the country to be selected in Sedgefield in 1983, and I tried 10 times to be a Labour candidate and failed every time. And I succeeded there, and the Labour Party, by the way, at the time in 1983, was in favour of pulling out of Europe. And Margaret Thatcher was the champion for European Union membership. So at my selection, I said I was not in favour of withdrawing from Europe. And people thought I had blown the thing, but actually it turned out, bizarrely, that even though it was an old mining constituency and people were quite socially conservative, actually most of the people thought that leaving Europe wasn't a sensible thing to do. So in a funny way, it turned the selection for me. And the other thing was, before I became Labour leader, I was right out there, way out there, saying Labour had to change, it had to reform fundamentally and so on. And I remember John Smith, who was my mentor and a very good friend of mine, who was the Labour leader at the time, called me into his office and said, Tony, you've got to stop doing this. He said, you're never going to become leader if you carry on doing this. And then when John tragically died, just at that moment in time, funnily enough, all the things that I'd been doing that seemed not politically sensible, suddenly the party said, no, actually, we've got to have someone who really is going to change the Labour Party. And so the things that had counted against me suddenly counted for me, and I became the leader. But the point, the lesson is that sometimes it's not just that you feel better about yourself if you're trying most of the time to do what you really believe in. It's that in the end, you're more likely to succeed because you never know how things are going to change around you. Yeah. And at least if you've held true to what you believe and you really think, you get a certain degree of respect for that. And sometimes you just find that then bizarrely it ends you up in being the right person, the right place at the right time. Yeah. Anyway, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. Guys, can we get a massive round of applause?